generally see traditionally is with the genus, the abstraction, and the class, is that principles are not, concepts are not sufficient for their own realization. So because you have a concept, it doesn't mean that the concept exists. So concepts are often viewed as possibilities to be, right? Because you have a concept of $100, it doesn't mean that you have $100. And so then you have basically, on the traditional view of concepts, concepts are relative beings. They have relative truth, right? And their truth is somehow indebted to something else. And of course, this is where Hegel's view is radically different. The concept is self-particularizing, self-differentiating. And for that reason, according to Hegel, it's a possibility that makes itself actual, or makes itself particular. And so you have really a revolution in the way in which concepts are understood. One of the things that's interesting is that for Hegel, concepts are inherently synthetic, right? So the concept's going to particularize itself. It has to amplify itself beyond what it is. And traditionally, that's not what concepts do, right? From the concept alone, you don't know whether it exists. But according to Hegel, the concept is somehow amplifying itself into reality, if you will.
Can I interrupt for a second? Now,
of course.
What about, you already talked about it, but maybe you want to give a quick summary. What about Neoplatonic thought, for example? I mean, Plotinus, for example, his concept, or the one that emanates. I mean, isn't it something that is similar? I mean, you give an account of particulars in a way.
Yeah, exactly. It is very similar. The difference is Plotinus has to appeal to metaphor. So that's the problem, is Plotinus is very close. And Hegel draws a lot from the Neoplatonic tradition. It's just that Plotinus needs to appeal to metaphor, like flowering, the flowering and the overflowing, exactly because he doesn't have a logic of self-differentiation per se. He knows that really in a certain way, this needs to happen, but he can't really give us a logic for it. I think a lot of this actually has to do with the relationship of concept to contradiction, which I think is also novel in Hegel, but that's another.
Before we, because I want to ask questions about that too. Before we come to that, another example that comes to my mind is Schelling. You know, Hegel is known by some people as the philosopher of self-consciousness. Although, I mean, these are usually people who came from phenomenology of spirit, you know. But Schelling also gives self-consciousness, or the identity of self-identity of the self, self-identity with the self, as this beginning principle from which you can maybe derive plurality or multiplicity. Why do you think it doesn't work?
Yeah, I mean, so Schelling, I actually think Hegel owes a lot to Schelling. And I tried to make that clear in the first chapter. The problem is that Schelling tries to give an account of the origin of difference from Fichte's I, to begin basically with some kind of I, kind of undifferentiated I, from which all differentiation comes. Schelling has this innovation in the system of transcendental idealism of 1800 to say that the first principle of all philosophy needs to be the identity of synthesis and analysis. And basically, you know, Hegel in the Opposite Idea talks about the method as the unity of synthesis and analysis. It's just that for Hegel, it comes at the end, ultimately, right? Whereas Schelling saw as a first principle, just like Fichte has a first principle. And Hegel's whole philosophy is all about overturning first principles. Or to say that we begin with anarchism, the complete lack of principle, and then we, through the inherent dialectical development, come to the existence of the one Lord, the concept, the true agency, the one element of truth, which then realizes itself as idea, absolute idea, nature, spirit, etc. Right? So I think he owes a lot to Schelling, but Schelling himself in the system of 1800 says the first principle has to be an identity of synthesis and analysis. But then he actually reverts to treating it as an analytic identity. He doesn't really think it through, because this would actually demand that it be a difference as well as an identity between synthesis and analysis. But he only treats it as an identity. Right? Just like the identity of identity and difference has to also be the difference between identity and difference. And he doesn't take that step. And this also explains why later on he gives up on this attempt to explain why are there differences. He doesn't think you can account for that conceptually. So when Hegel, I don't talk about this in the book, but when Hegel says that it's thought to escape comprehension how the finite comes from the infinite, he's in part talking about Schelling. Schelling, who says you can't explain that. That's not something you can do with philosophy. You can go from finitude to infinitude, but you won't go from infinitude to finitude. So Hegel is explicitly, I think, implicitly referring to Schelling's basically attitude that once you think about concepts as principles of universality, whose principle of difference has to come from outside of the class that's differentiated, you're never going to explain why there are differences. Then the absolute becomes this kind of indifference, right? And the presence of difference is just a mystery, a fundamental mystery, or what you hear the Schellingians talking about contingency, a fundamental contingency that can never be overcome, really. So yeah. I mean, it's a lot is owed to Schelling, and more discussion should be had there. And actually, Hegel's own philosophy makes a lot more sense when you read him with Schelling rather than by himself. And that's something that I've learned the hard way, I think, actually.
Yeah. But once again, it's important to emphasize, as you have already stated, the concept that differentiates itself is not Hegel's beginning. It's not the way he begins.
Exactly.
Although the thought begins in this way, I mean, it immediately differentiates itself.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, it has to determine itself to be self-differentiating. It has to determine itself to be self-particularizing.
It shows itself as self-differentiating.
Exactly.
And you speak of these three dyads, like you mentioned identity and difference, analytic and synthetic, and also universality and singularity. I guess there are like some fundamental similarity between these three dyads.
Yeah, so I think the most relative point of overlap is to see how traditionally universality is conceived as, or is conceived as a principle by which particulars are unified. So we have the genus, the abstraction, and the class are forms of, say, identity. But we can think of identity separately from universality. We can talk about the self-identity of a particular that's, say, one in number, but isn't shared in common, like Achilles or something. But I think the most salient aspect of identity as concerns the discourse on universality is that universality is traditionally conceived as a principle of identity amongst the particulars, that is a shared identity. Even if it's just the shared identity of belonging to the same class, or being instantiated by the same abstraction or falling within the same genus, right? We have this shared identity. Connected with that is the idea that the universal, even though, say, in the case of a genus, it includes differentiations, is not sufficient for differentiating itself. So mammal doesn't account for the differences within the genus. It doesn't on its own give us new knowledge about the differences within the class, right? In order to, one could say, get that new knowledge, you have to appeal to a different principle beyond the class itself, right? And then you have a synthetic thought, right? Then you have a synthesis. You have mammal synthesized with another principle of difference. But Hegel's idea is that the universal is self-particularizing. So analytically, it is synthetic. Right? What the universal is, we think, well, that's the analytic truth, is that it is synthetic as such. And that's why you don't have to appeal to a second principle of difference. Now, of course, how that dialectic plays out, you have to go through you have to go through those stages: universality, particularity, singularity, and then see how they, of course, unfold.
When you speak of these finite concepts that are not really self-particularizing, like abstract concept, genus, and class, these are still to be found in the constitution of Hegel's concept.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. And that's the trick, right? That's the Hegelian trick. The Hegelian trick is that the concept is that which differentiates itself. So it must become different to what it is. It must negate what it is in order to be what it is. And that means that the universal has to deny its self-differentiating character, posit itself as non-self-differentiating, and therefore it becomes responsible for the very differences between genus, class, and abstraction. That these themselves are ways in which the self-differentiating universal negates itself and exists in the form of its own self-negation. Of course, these finite determinations undermine themselves in the course of the dialectic, thereby returning us back to the universal, except that when we return back to the universal, it's different from where we began, because the whole process is a return. And that's what singularity is, right? It's the return of universality out of the self-alienation that the universal experiences, you could say, in genus, class, and abstraction. But yeah, so genus, class, and abstraction all show up. And so if we were to think about these as just other to Hegel's thought, as just different, just rejected and canceled, right? Then we wouldn't understand Hegel's philosophy at all. And actually he says, abstraction is the soul. It's the soul of the concept. If you get rid of these forms of universality, you don't really have any content. Right? So the very thing he's overcoming must have a place. If it doesn't have a place, then Hegel's work is a complete failure. And this is actually why there's this wonderful charitability. People look at Hegel and often as a kind of, it's strange to think of Hegel as an uncharitable thinker, because he's so extremely charitable that everyone, not everybody, but a lot of the ideas which Hegel's overcoming have a place, he tries to find a place for as much as he can. So there's this really amazing charity. It's funny to think about the dialectic as a charitable way of thinking, but that's what it is.
Yeah, I mean, I would say people who focus more on phenomenology of spirit, they also see all the other thinkers, but only in a kind of negative, under a negative light, I would say. But in the logic, I mean, in the system they place, as you said. But I think it's also important to repeat this in a way, because I mean, you said it's really interesting. If you only focus on self-differentiation to conceive what it really is, then it's self-differentiation. It differentiates itself. But if it's just self-differentiation, then it immediately differentiates itself into non-self-differentiation. So it's not self-differentiating. Yeah, once it differentiates itself.
Yes, and that's what particularity is. Yeah, that's particularity. And then, of course, there's a third step. And this is a very coarse summary. And the third step is that the universal as particular is the self-differentiating universal that exists outside itself, or this Entäußerung, right? This self-externalized form. And what is outside itself must itself be outside itself. Otherwise, it's not outside itself. And once you see that what is outside itself is outside itself, it's no longer outside of itself anymore. And that's the advent of singularity. It's the unity of universality and particularity. It's the return to universality out of particularity. And it is, it's the Einzelheit, the one and all, the one and only. And so there's this, third stage. That is the self-overcoming of those forms of alienation. We see kind of this dialectical structure kind of anticipated, although not fully developed, say, in the logic of finitude and infinity, where finitude through its self-negation gives us infinity. There's a kind of self-negation of finitude that happens in particularity that brings us to the singularity as a further enriched, further developed form of the true infinite.
And it also kind of, I mean, we always talk about the disadvantages of speaking in terms of, you know, formulas and schemes, like to come to an understanding of the later movements in logic or in the system in terms of what comes prior, but also this movement and the concept, it looks like the key to many other things that come later in the system.
Yeah, and I think that's why I focused on the concept rather than idea, which would have also been justified.
Yeah, even the transition from the logic to nature.
Yes, exactly.
Seems there are a lot of parallels with this transition from the particular to the singular.
Yeah, and I think so. This is why, I mean, I've focused on the logic of the concept, but it is a partial analysis, obviously. But when Hegel says the concept is the sole element of truth, it indicates that the concept has a kind of special status. It's the agency that determines itself to be true. It objectifies itself. It particularizes itself into the self-subsistent totality that is objectivity, and then into the self-knowing objectivity, right? And so this is why I've kind of honed in on the concept as really a necessary requisite for working through idea, teleology, absolute idea, all of that. By working on concept, I'm not even at the true concept, right? The concept in its truth, we have to wait till the idea, which you've written on a lot, right? So in a certain way, it's anticipating what's coming, but I think it gives us really, we can put it this way, the formal structure of what, of conceptuality. That's what it is, right? In an ironic way, it's a very formal discussion because we're not saying what the singular concepts are, except particular universal singular. The concepts as such ought to have these three if they're going to be concepts, right? We're just saying what a concept is, what it is to be a concept, not what the concepts are. That's the whole of the logic, where we get the whole, right? So this is a very formal book in that way, inevitably formal, but in Hegel's sense of formal, which still, of course, has content.
Yeah, and I know I always bring this up when we discuss this book, that truth comes up with the idea. So it involves objectivity. Right. But I know very well that you're cautious about this too. But it also reminds me of your talk about the ontological argument in the book. Yeah. It also has a kind of, it takes a lot of space in your book. You see some connection between the ontological argument in Hegel's derivation of the singular, what we have just talked about, from the universal or the particular. Am I correct? I mean, could you perhaps talk a little about that? I mean, it's a bit tricky, I think, because being an existence in Hegel, they are quite elementary determinacies. I mean, they come in the logic of being. And the concept,
Exactly. Yeah. So this is a hugely important point. Throughout the book, I will use conventional language, like I said, regularly, but you're exactly right. The precise way of saying it is that the concept objectifies itself. It makes itself objective. And that's different from just saying that the concept exists. Because as you point out, the concept already exists at the outset. Existence is already there. It has being, determinate being, existence, etc.
Yeah, let's
So
clear that up too, because yeah, I
yeah,
said in logical
because,
being, it depends
and
on the
there's a
transaction.
nice
Yeah.
quote. So the first point is that the concept determines itself to be the self-subsistent totality. I think that is the more precise way of articulating the transition from concept to objectivity. Of course, in the book, I don't spend a lot of time with judgment and syllogism. Richard Winfield has a book where he goes through all of this, right? If I were a better student, I would know the title of the book. But he goes through all.
From the concept to objectivity.
Of course, I just said it. From the concept. There you are, the true disciple. From the concept to objectivity, yeah, from concept to objectivity. So to flesh out the whole so-called ontological argument, you have to go through all of this. But he does say that this development is prefigured in the self-particularization of the concept, or because what the concept does by singularizing itself, by making itself into Einzelheit, it makes itself into the one and only. It's not yet an object. It's not an object until we get to objectivity, which is after judgment and syllogism, right? But we see that there is a prefiguring of objectivity in the notion of singularity as the one and only, the concept that is self-mediated, that is the whole and the element of the whole, et cetera, et cetera. But it is important to emphasize that it's objectivity, because this is the self-subsistent totality, the concept that has realized itself as self-subsistent totality. We have the structure of self-determination here. We've overcome the structure of reflection that we see is at work in existence, where the difference between ground and grounded is at work, right? Where what you see in the logic of reflection and essence is this, it is a logic of ideality where otherness is overcome, but it's one whereby a distinction between determiner and determined continues to play a role. So we have the difference between ground and grounded, cause and effect, and we have the self-development of this distinction between determiner and determined, which of course ultimately negates itself in logic of self-determination. There's a nice quote where Hegel actually clarifies this. I'll just read it because it's actually helpful. In the sphere of being, immediacy is being itself and existence, Dasein. In the sphere of essence, it is concrete existence, existence, and then actuality and substantiality. In the sphere of concept, besides being immediacy as abstract universality, it is now objectivity. These expressions, so here's the important caveat, when the exactitude of philosophical conceptual distinctions is not at stake, may be used as synonymous, right? And in the book, I have used them sometimes as synonymous, but this is again, mostly for the sake of drawing out how Hegel's thinking is different from the tradition, where we ordinarily think about the concept as existing when we say that it is instantiated in a particular, right? So are there such and such things? Well, are there instances of the concept, right? And then he says, but the determinations are derived from the necessity of the concept. Being as such, the first immediacy in existence is the same immediacy with the first determinateness. And then he goes on and on and on, right? So when the exactitude of philosophical distinctions is not at stake, we can use them synonymously, but otherwise we shouldn't. Because that conflates the logic of essence with logic of the concept. Right?
Yeah, but it's not just it distinguishes his way of using these concepts from others, which you clarify quite well in your book, I would say, but also it relates his concepts and his discussions to other people's, other thinkers, philosophers. Parallel discussions, I would say. Yeah. You also say, I think in chapter 14, that Hegel's singularity, his concept of singularity, is a way to frame a critique of a Pittsburgh school's tendency to overlook the singularity of the concept, and instead absolutize the particular instead of the singular. Could you perhaps talk about talk about it a little?
Right. So maybe we'll just talk a little bit about maybe tendencies in Brandom and McDowell's thinking. There's a lot to be said here, but I think there is some ambiguity in their thinking, arguably a confusion between empirical concepts and logical ones. And we shouldn't even call empirical concepts concepts per se. We should say something like empirical representations. So I think when we look at Brandom, for example, he basically argues that logical concepts have the function to make explicit the function of ordinary empirical concepts like blue and sour. But it seems to me that logic is not exactly an explication of how ordinary empirical concepts work, but actually the opposite of that. McDowell says something similar, that the free movement of the concept fits empirical inquiry. But there's something really confused here, I think. So if I have a representation of $100, the representation of the $100 from if I have this representation, it doesn't follow that I have $100 in my wallet. Right? So if I have the so-called concept of $100, I don't have $100. It's not self-particularizing. Whether it's true that I have $100 depends on more than just the concept in scare quotes here, right? It's a finite determination. It's not self-particularizing. It's the concept of $100 is not itself $100, right? The concept of $100 is not itself $100, but the concept itself is a concept, and the concept itself is self-particularizing. Exactly because it is because the concept itself is a concept, it is one concept among many. So the concepts of the logic are self-particularizing. It's a self-predicative and self-particularizing. That's its form. The empirical determinations are completely different. They lack exactly what is necessary in order to count as logical categories. So it's not that categories of the logic somehow uncover the form of empirical determination, but they're actually in radical contrast and otherness to it. So the free movement of the concept doesn't fit empirical inquiry at all. It's really not at all like that. Now, maybe one can press the difference too much. And I want to talk about maybe how one could press the difference too much, but I think that's one of the big problems, is that this non-self-predicative structure, which is arguably the self-alienation of the concept, one way in which the concept is so-called outside of itself in some form of particularity. What the school seems to have done is it seems to have absolutized this form and overlooked this self-particularizing dimension, the singular dimension. Because even, of course, abstract universals have this structure of singularity. They have a unity of universality and particularity, in the simple sense that the universal is both a common term and it's a particular universal. It's this such and such. And so even universals themselves have something like abstract universals have a kind of unity of universality and particularity built into them. So yeah, that's just a few words on one of the concerns about the way in which the relationship of logic to empirical determinations is understood. I have other concerns about contradiction and about the logic of inference, as we see in Brandom, this inferentialism that Brandom attributes to Hegel, I think is also problematic for the reasons that really I've already said, that Hegel's philosophy doesn't work by means of inference in the traditional sense that we understand it, right? And it's not, the logic itself doesn't involve a bunch of reasoners engaging with each other in inferences and dialogue. It's really a self-developing system that deviates from inference understood in the traditional way. So yeah, these are just a few kind of points that are worth mentioning, I think. There's other good things about the school, it's just, and the various systems, but I find that to be particularly, what the school sometimes obscures is the fact that Hegel cares about the absolute. Every definition of, every category is a definition of the absolute. And somehow that's just overlooked completely. But, you know, because they're so focused on the empirical, on the sensuous, really say, well, I can't overawed by it. that you miss the absolute significance of logic, I think.
Yeah, I mean, to connect this to a kind of very general objection against Hegel, raised against Hegel, I would say, we know, and other people, critics also know, that Hegel has this category or the concept of singularity, which is sometimes even translated as the individual. But still, many raise this criticism, arguing that there is no place for the individual in Hegel's system. I mean, you made this distinction between empirical concepts and the logical concepts. Do you see, as a kind of very general question, I know that is not directly related to your book maybe, but do you see a place for the individual in Hegel's system? What do you think about this general criticism?
It's very strange that Hegel would be accused of totalizing in such a way that the singular would disappear. Because that's the consequence when you take a traditional view of concepts and you apply it to all things. Then you get the result that postmodernism is so worried about. So when you take, for example, this idea that the universal is only a principle of identity, and you apply it absolutely, then all difference disappears, and therefore also all singularity vanishes. There's no differentiated particular anymore. So I think that's what you get when you don't rethink the concept as self-particularizing. But once the concept is reconceived as self-particularizing, what you account for the first time on rational grounds in the history of philosophy is exactly what postmodernists would say Hegel doesn't account for, namely singularity. It's just that the kind of singularity is, it's not exactly what you'd expect. It's really not only the absolute, but also the element of the absolute. And it's a situation wherein the element of the absolute is not absolutely other to the absolute itself. It's a very, there's a finesse here, but the basic idea is that the objection just overlooks the logic of the concept. That's all it does. Now, once we take it on its own terms, then maybe we get into nuanced forms of the objection, right? And there are arguably nuanced forms of the objection, but the real kind of gross form of it is that Hegel totalizes and thereby loses the individual or the singular. But the very notion of the totality in Hegel is to account for singularity. That's the whole project, is to do what postmodernists say Hegel really isn't, is Hegel is abolishing. It's a very strange objection, actually. It's not a very careful one. It's really lazy, actually. There are more subtle grounds to critique Hegel than that one. I think it's one of the laziest objections and a little bit annoying. Not that it's your view. I just find it a little lazy. I find it a bit lazy. Yeah.
Okay. Then, yeah. I mean, we're also running short of time, but I still would like to. I said I was going to ask about your take on the principle of non-contradiction, because you talk about that a lot in your book. You want to say a couple of things about that?
Yeah,
because I mean, not every Hegel scholar has the same interpretation. I mean, I think it's a fact for the last more than 200 years, right?
Yeah. So it's apparently it's a relatively controversial thesis to say that in Hegel there are true contradictions. And that's my view, is when you read Hegel, I think it's obvious although it's not obvious, I know, to a lot of Hegel scholars, and it's something that needs to be defended, and it's not there are reasons to hold, to reject the thesis. But I just want to, maybe I'll say a few things about why I hold it. There are a number of points that we can make that even people who deny that there are true contradictions in Hegel would agree on. Right? So one is that the law of non-contradiction is not a law of thought per se. There is no, really, there aren't laws of thought, right, that are set out in advance that then are applied to contents of thinking. So generally that's the wrong framework to be thinking about thought, right? To be thinking about thought in terms of laws that are distinct from the particulars that they govern, that are indifferent to the contents that they apply to. So whether it's a law of non-contradiction or some other law, it's probably the wrong way to think about thinking. And certainly the law of non-contradiction is not posited at the beginning. It's certainly not present there as a presupposition. Whatever truth may be in it would have to be established through some self-developing dialectical process. So it's certainly not a presupposition. Thinking really shouldn't be understood in terms of lawfulness. That's probably misleading in Hegel. Also, I would say that one thing that Hegel explicitly rejects is this idea that contradictions are explosive, that from contradiction, you can derive anything and nothing. Everything. Right, but actually what happens is, as we know, right, as you read through the dialect, through the being is nothing, nothing is being, that gives you, so you have becoming and then you have determinate being, right? And different, you have identity and it becomes difference. You have the identity of identity and difference that gives you contradiction, right? You have different contradictions get you different results. So you have specific contradiction results in specific outcomes, right? So certainly we have a rejection of explosion, and that's clear. We're not thinking in terms of laws or presupposing it generally. Now it's interesting because, so with all that said, the question really, I think, the really interesting question for us is where we can get into some subtlety and detail about different interpretations, is whether the contradictions that arise within logic and within the system in general, nature and spirit, not just in logic, whether they are only canceled or are they canceled and preserved, right? So some people want to say that they're just canceled and they're not preserved. Categories are preserved, but not the contradictions themselves. So is it that the contradictions are canceled simply, or are they canceled and preserved? In some cases, in all cases, do we have to go on a case-by-case basis? That kind of thing, that's the question. I think that's more interesting. I think otherwise we can agree on all those other points well enough, hopefully. If we can't, then that's a problem, actually. I mean, Hegel himself says, if we're going to speak about laws, it's better to say everything contradicts itself is a more true law than nothing does. And he does say every concept is contradictory. And he also says that speculative thought consists in holding on to the contradiction. So there's a lot of good reasons, prima facie, to read Hegel as saying that there are true contradictions. Now, I want to just make two quick points. We don't have enough time. I'm going to talk about this in another session with Graham Priest and Elena Fakar later, so I'll have time to give a whole paper on this topic. But 2 points. So one is that when you think about what a universal is, I think you inevitably find yourself in a contradiction that's unavoidable and inescapable. And it's quite simple. This is something Plato noticed in the Parmenides, and it's that a universal is one in number. So the universal is one universal. It's this universal. But this universal that's one in number is present in or instantiated in multiple particulars. This means that the self-same universal that's one in number is present in a number of different particulars. And that means that the very same universal must be, to use Plato's terms, as a whole in each particular. In other words, it is fully realized in each one, but each particular is different. So it's fully realized in each one, and each particular is different from the other. That means that the universal is different from itself because different particulars are not the same. And yet, the very same universal is in all of them. So it needs to be the same as itself and different from itself, if it's going to be multiply instantiated. So I think if there are any universals, there are true contradictions. So that's my view. And I think Hegel realized that. He saw this problem of instantiation in Plato, and I think realized that once you allow true contradictions, it's no longer a problem anymore. I'll also say that in the logic itself, so I think this is just a challenge for those who think there are not true contradictions, is to maintain a notion of universality that has multiple instances and not have a contradiction of the kind that I just stated. You can try to be conceptual eliminativist and get rid of concepts, but that's not what Hegel does. So that would be something else. The other point is that the logic is atemporal. This is kind of a simple point, but the logic has no reference to time, right?
No.
And so the categories are just atemporal. And so if you have a contradiction in the logic, that's an atemporal contradiction. So if it is true in the logic, it's always true. Now, if that contradiction is canceled, it's not canceled at a particular time because the logic is atemporal. So if that contradiction is canceled, it's also an atemporal cancellation. So this means that the contradiction that arises and the contradiction that is canceled, they're both atemporal. That is to say, the contradiction is always there. It never ceases to be. Even when it's canceled,
yeah, it undermines what's being derived. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's both present eternally, atemporally, and canceled eternally, atemporally. The development, one could say, the contradiction and its canceling are both true. So my view is that it's canceled and preserved. And it must be because of the atemporality of logic as such. Now, it is true that logic gives rise to nature, but that doesn't mean logic disappears and ceases to be logic, because here we are in the 21st century able to think logic just like Hegel did. That is to say that the logic is just as much accessible to us as it was then, because it's a fully non-temporal, non-spatial set of contents. So whatever contradiction or cancellation of contradiction that happens at the level of logic seems to me to entail that there must be true contradiction. And one of those is this meta feature of the contradiction being true and its cancellation being true.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just coming up with this just now, but would you think that maybe, I mean, these tendencies have to do with maybe focusing too much on the dialectical moment at the expense of the speculative, or maybe focusing on the logic of essence at the expense of the logic of the concept? I mean, maybe, yeah. I mean, these are kind of general problems that undermines all these tendencies.
Yeah. So I think contradiction is just, there's no reason to be so concerned about contradiction. Actually, why are we so worried about it? Contradiction is one of the determinations in the logic of essence. Really, it's actually a very good question. We're not so preoccupied with being. No one's asking, are there true beings? Are there really true beings? Of course there are. No one's asking that question. Are there true contradictions? Of course there are. People are asking about contradiction and not about being, or not about, are there true concepts? Because I think traditionally there is a profound fear of contradiction. There's not a profound fear of being that leads people to ask, are there really true beings? Well, being is canceled, right? It's canceled. Does that mean that all the beings are false? No, that's not what that means. It's interesting that what we would apply to the contradiction, we wouldn't apply to other concepts. Now, that's not just hypocrisy. It's actually, it's more than that, right? It's more than just hypocrisy. It's actually, I think, a lack of insight into, it indicates that there is, one could say, a concern that is brought in from the outside, but isn't there in Hegel himself, I think. I don't think the worry of, are there really true contradictions, is a worry for Hegel. What is it? You have this claim from his dissertation. Contradiction is the rule of truth. consistency falsehood or something like this. A lot of this debate depends on how you think about speculation and its relation to dialectic, right? I think. But if Hegel's right that speculation involves holding on to the contradiction, speculation wouldn't involve simply canceling it. But I think it's probably not good for us to be too preoccupied with determinations in logic of essence. But I think by the time that you get to concept, contradiction is canceled, but it's preserved. It's there in the concept. The concept is contradictory, just not reducible to it. Contradiction plays an integral role in what the concept is. It's the whole and an element of the whole. It's the universal and the particular. It's universal, particular, and singular, right? The singular is universal, particular, singular, and the singular is one of the three and not the other two. So it is the others and not the others. So it's explicitly contradictory. But how could it be contradictory if it's been overcome? Well, it's there, just as the others are constitutive, but the concept is not reducible to it. I've just made I've kind of honed in on this concept of contradiction because I think it's the hesitancy to accept true contradiction is actually a stumbling block for thinking dialectically. At least that's my view. And I think in the end, if it turns out that there are no true contradictions, the postmodernists might be right in the end. And Hegel will be a one-sided thinker for whom one could say the true is the consistent. And then we have a kind of dualism between the consistent and the inconsistent. And this dualism reappears in a way that's problematic for Hegel. And the totality can't be completed. I think it's really the only way of actually having a totality that's completable is one that is dialethic. But that's another topic, and that's probably take us far.
Which would call another Hegel.
Yeah. It's really it's a one-sided thinking. It's to say there are no true contradictions is in the end, I think, to say that one side of the opposition is true, and that's again, I would say, an elementary error.
Yeah, and I think you're definitely right. It all boils down to this indication of the need of coming to terms with the concept and the derivation of singularity. All is in there. It's kind of a really nice key to, to the solution of all these problems.
Yeah,
and that's why it was so important, I think, to write on this topic, which you did in your book.
Thanks, Emre. And you're going to be publishing a book on life, right?
Hopefully soon. Yeah. Yeah, it's almost finished. Yeah.
We'll hold you to that. Now that we have a public expression of it's almost finished. So
yeah,
we'll hold you to it.
Okay. Speaking of my project of publishing it, perhaps would you like to talk about your current plans or like what you're working right now? And
well, yeah, thanks. Yeah. Well, how
does it connect to your book, if it does or not?
Yeah. So I have some other projects some are loosely connected to Hegel and others that are really not so much. I have a book on Kassir that I'm working on, but that's a bit tangential. There are Hegelian.
You already published a book on Kassir, right?
I have published a book on Kassir, and I'm working on another one that I hope will be finished next year on mythology, a topic that Hegel doesn't actually spend a lot of time thinking about. So actually one of those areas that actually Hegel doesn't have a lot to teach us, actually. But I'm also working on an edited volume right now on the legacy of classical German philosophy in the Kyoto School. I think this will be of interest to people who are interested in my book here. The Kyoto School is a 20th century Japanese philosophical movement. Main figures are Nishida, Tanabe, Nishitani, and others. And Nishida and Tanabe, for example, draw on Hegel at length. And for the Kyoto School thinkers, German idealism was a very important movement. And there haven't been a lot of people who have published on this connection. So hoping to publish a book that explores the influence of Hegel and Schelling and Fichte and other people on the Kyoto school. And a lot of these ideas about dialectic, self-particularization, contradictory unity, all of this shows up in Kyoto school. Not as well known amongst Hegelians, but I think Hegelians and people interested in Hegel and systematic philosophy would find it fascinating, actually. And,
yeah,
a lot of the questions
sounds great then.
Yeah, a lot of the questions and problems that are being raised in this 20th century Japanese school are really the same ones raised by the German idealists. How does the infinite become finite, for example? And they draw on the German idealism to answer the question. So in Japan, the tradition takes a very different turn than it did in the West, which moved in this analytic continental split, where those questions of the 19th century were now being resolved rather than solved. But in Japan, anyway, they were still being taken seriously. So anyway, I hope someone will.
Yeah, if you would like to, I don't know, make a more detailed introduction, or if you'd like to thematize a problem in your book, you're welcome to do it here on our stage.
That sounds good. Sounds good. Thanks, Emre.
Thank you very much. I mean, it was really great talking to you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I hope it was clear. It's kind of late where I am, so there may be some moments of ambiguity.
Yeah, I know.
It's a thick book. It's hard to remember everything I read.
It is. It is. It took some time for me to read it.
Well, it's impressive that you actually got through it. So congratulations. One of the few
Thanks.
in the world to get through the whole thing.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Okay. Well, I guess we'll call it a night then. Is that?
Yeah.
Or call it a day for you. All right.
Yeah,
thanks a lot,
right.
and I guess we'll talk again soon.
Thank you, and thanks to everyone who watched and listened to our conversation. Okay. See you later in another event.
Yeah.
Bye.